Ethan had spent years shutting everyone out, hiding behind his silence and his pain. No one could reach him until one rainy afternoon. A kind-hearted waitress offered a simple hug that would change his world forever. Ethan was a 12-year-old boy who had learned early in life that the world could be a harsh and unforgiving place. He was born with a physical disability that made walking painful and exhausting. While other kids ran freely across playgrounds, played tag, and climbed trees, Ethan had to carefully plan every step he took. Simple things like getting on the bus or walking down the school hallway were challenges he faced every single day. Over time, he began to feel different from everyone else. There was an invisible wall separating him from the world around him. At first, Ethan had tried to be like other kids. He had hoped that if he joined in games or tried to speak up in class, he could be treated like everyone else. But life hadn't been kind to him. Classmates stared at him with curiosity, some with pity, and a few with outright cruelty. There were whispers when he passed by, and sometimes, during group activities, kids would hesitate to include him, unsure of how to treat someone with a disability. Each of these moments, though small on the surface, piled up in Ethan's mind like heavy stones, one on top of the other, until he felt crushed under the weight of constant rejection. As the days went on, Ethan began to withdraw. He stopped raising his hand in class and refused invitations to birthday parties. He found it easier to avoid people than to face the sting of being excluded or treated differently. He stopped sharing his thoughts or feelings, convinced that no one really wanted to hear them anyway. Even when someone offered to help him, he would politely decline or walk away, not wanting to appear weak or vulnerable. Over time, he built a protective shell around himself, one that no one could penetrate, because it felt safer to keep everyone at a distance than to risk getting hurt again. At home, things weren't always easier. His parents loved him deeply, but they worried constantly about his future. They encouraged him to make friends, to participate in school events, and to try new activities, but Ethan often refused. He had learned to believe that no matter how hard he tried, the world would never see him as equal. Some days he would sit by the window and watch other children playing outside, wishing he could be a part of their world, but then quickly convincing himself that it was impossible. The feeling of being trapped between what he longed for and what he thought he deserved created a loneliness that he carried everywhere, despite all of this. Ethan had an inner world filled with imagination. He loved drawing, reading stories, and creating little worlds where he could be anything he wanted: a superhero who could run faster than anyone, an explorer who traveled far-off lands, or a knight who saved the day. But even in his imaginary worlds, the loneliness followed him. He wanted someone to share his victories and adventures with, but he had stopped hoping that it would ever happen in real life. At school, teachers noticed his quiet nature. Some tried to reach out, offering encouragement and praise, but Ethan remained distant. He had learned to hide his feelings behind a mask of politeness and quiet acceptance, afraid that showing too much emotion would make him a target. Lunchtimes were the hardest. While other children laughed and joked with their friends, Ethan sat alone at the edge of the cafeteria, focusing on the small details around him: the pattern on the floor tiles, the way the sunlight hit the windows, the sound of voices blending together. These details became his companions, small anchors in a world that often felt chaotic and unkind. Ethan's disability had also taught him patience and resilience. Every step he took required effort, planning, and determination. Every task, no matter how simple it seemed to others, was a test of his willpower. Yet, despite his inner strength, the constant social rejection left him feeling small and invisible. He longed for someone to see him, not as a disabled boy or different, but simply as Ethan, a person with thoughts, feelings, and dreams. The ache for connection was always there, even if he refused to show it. Inside his mind, Ethan replayed moments of rejection again and again, turning them over like puzzle pieces he could never fit together. He wondered why he couldn't be like other kids, why something about him made people pull away, why no one had ever reached out in a way that made him feel truly seen. Each memory reinforced his decision to shut people out. It was easier, he told himself, to refuse everyone than to face the pain of being hurt again. Ethan's world had become small, predictable, and controlled. He followed routines, avoided situations that might bring embarrassment, and carefully guarded his heart. There was a quiet sadness in his eyes that those who didn't know him well might not notice. But anyone who looked closely could see it. Deep down, he still longed for friendship, laughter, and kindness. But he had convinced himself that these things were not meant for him, even in moments of solitude. Ethan's mind wandered to thoughts of what life could be if someone truly understood him. He dreamed of a friend who would laugh with him, not pity him, or a teacher who would notice his efforts, not just his limitations. But these were fleeting hopes, quickly suppressed by the harsh reality of his everyday experiences. Over time, he learned to live with the emptiness, to accept it as a part of who he was, and to hide his pain behind a quiet smile. And so, Ethan moved through his days like a shadow, present but unseen, cautious yet observant, lonely yet resilient. He had built walls around his heart, walls meant to protect him from disappointment, rejection, and the judgment of others. But no matter how high he built them, deep inside, a small part of him still wished, hoped, and longed for a single moment of genuine kindness, something that might finally let him believe that the world could be a place where he belonged. Every Saturday morning, Ethan's mother would take him to a small, cozy cafe not far from their home. It had become a kind of routine, a quiet escape after his long therapy sessions. The cafe was on tea fancy, but it had a warmth that made it feel welcoming. The smell of fresh bread and coffee, the soft chatter of people, the gentle clinking of cups and plates. For most people, it was just a place to eat and drink, but for Ethan, it was a window into a world that seemed both inviting and out of reach. He would sit at the same table every week by the window, watching the world outside but rarely participating in the world. Inside, the other children who came into the cafe would often run around, laugh loudly, and talk to the staff as if they were old friends. Ethan, however, stayed silent. He did not speak to the waitresses, did not ask for anything beyond what his mother ordered, and often avoided even making eye contact. His mother would try to engage him, asking how his week had been or what he wanted for lunch. But Ethan would reply in one-word answers or shake his head. It was not rudeness. It was a shield he had perfected over the years. He had learned that speaking less meant less chance of being judged, teased, or ignored. The cafe staff had noticed Ethan over the months. They were accustomed to many types of customers, but Ethan was different in a quiet way. Most people assumed he was shy or unwell, and many gave him space, assuming he did not want attention. Among them was Lily, a young waitress who worked there part-time. She had a gentle demeanor and a way of noticing things others overlooked. She saw the sadness in Ethan's eyes, the way he held himself with caution, the careful movements he made when navigating the cafe's tables and chairs, while other staff treated him politely and moved on. Lily found herself quietly observing him, wondering about the life behind his silent exterior. Ethan's Saturdays were predictable. He arrived, usually a little late from therapy, walked slowly to his favorite table, and waited. He sometimes brought a small notebook or a book to keep himself occupied. He liked to watch the people outside, noticing details like the way a dog wagged its tail or how the wind moved the leaves on the trees. These small observations were like little adventures for him, moments of life he could control and understand. Unlike the unpredictable world of social interactions, Lily, meanwhile, made a small effort to make him feel included without forcing it. She would bring the order to the table with a gentle smile, sometimes adding a tiny note like, "Hope you enjoy this," written on a napkin. Ethan rarely responded, but over time he began to notice her kindness. He did not trust it immediately. Trust did not come easily to him, but her consistent, gentle approach planted small seeds of curiosity and hope. He began to recognize that she was different from the others, that she did not see him as a problem or an inconvenience. It was during these visits that Ethan's inner world began to stretch slightly beyond the confines of his own thoughts. He started noticing details about the cafe that he had never paid attention to before: the soft music playing in the background, the way sunlight streamed through the windows at certain angles, the way the barista carefully arranged the pastries. These small observations were comforting, but they also highlighted how separate he still felt. He could enjoy the world around him, but he could not fully enter it. Some Saturdays were harder than others. When therapy sessions were particularly exhausting, Ethan would drag himself into the cafe, barely able to sit upright. On those days, he wanted nothing more than to be left alone. He would focus on the table, the cup of cocoa or the notebook in front of him, shutting out everything else. His mother would chat with Lily or the other staff, but Ethan would retreat further into his shell. It was during these moments of exhaustion and solitude that his loneliness felt heaviest. Despite his quiet nature, there was a kind of subtle rhythm to his presence. Regular customers began to recognize him. Some gave him a small nod or a smile, acknowledging his existence without expecting interaction. He liked these small gestures because they respected his boundaries. But even with this recognition, Ethan remained wary. He had learned over the years that most kindnesses were fleeting, that people often turned away when things became uncomfortable. He did not expect anything to last, and so he held on to his distance as a protective measure. Lily, however, approached him differently. She did not try to force conversation or attention. She simply acknowledged him with warmth and patience. Over weeks and months, Ethan began to notice the little things she did, the way she remembered which seat he preferred, the way she arranged his drink, just the way he liked it, the way she spoke to him with a quiet, friendly tone rather than loud cheerfulness or forced enthusiasm. These were small gestures, but for Ethan, they were unusual. No one had ever treated him with this kind of gentle attentiveness without expecting anything in return. On particularly rainy Saturdays, when fewer customers were in the cafe, Ethan sometimes stayed longer than usual. He liked the calm atmosphere, the soft patter of raindrops against the windows, and the quiet hum of conversation around him. During these moments, he would catch glimpses of Lily moving around the cafe, serving others, but always keeping an eye on him. There was a subtle reassurance in her presence, a quiet understanding that did not need words. Ethan began to realize that maybe, just maybe, there were people in the world who would not judge him, who would not reject him simply because he was different. Though he did not speak much, Ethan's mind was active. He observed human behavior, trying to understand why people acted the way they did. He noticed kindness, impatience, humor, and frustration. He noticed how people smiled when they were genuinely happy versus when they were pretending. And slowly, he began to wonder if he could let someone in, if he could trust that not all people would hurt him. It was a small spark, barely visible even to himself, but it was there a tiny thread connecting him to the possibility of connection. Over time, cafe became more than just a place to eat. It became a space where Ethan could exist in the presence of others without feeling pressured to perform or explain himself. It was a neutral territory where he could quietly observe, reflect, and without realizing it, begin to rebuild some trust in human kindness. Lily's gentle attention planted the first seeds of a change that would grow slowly but surely. Ethan's Saturdays in the cafe were a delicate balance between isolation and tentative connection. Each week he tested the waters, learning that he could exist among people without fear of judgment. The small, consistent kindnesses he experienced there began to break down the walls he had built, though he did not yet know it. Deep inside, a tiny part of him started to hope that maybe, one day, someone would reach out in a way that truly mattered. That Saturday, the sky was heavy with rain, and the streets outside the cafe were slick with water. Ethan arrived with his mother as usual, moving slowly and carefully, each step measured to avoid pain. The therapy session that morning had been particularly exhausting, and he could feel every ache in his legs as he walked. Normally, he would find comfort in the familiar routine of the cafe, the quiet hum of conversation, the soft music in the background. But today felt different. Today, a deep weariness weighed on him, heavier than the usual fatigue. His mother was running a little late, caught up in a last-minute errand, and Ethan was left sitting alone at their usual table by the window. He rested his chin on his hand, staring at the rain as it streamed down the glass, blurring the shapes of people walking by and the cars passing through puddles. There was a dull ache in his chest, a mixture of loneliness and exhaustion. In that moment, he felt the full weight of his isolation. No classmates, no friends, no familiar faces, just him, the rain. In the quiet of the cafe, most of the waitresses went about their work, refilling drinks, clearing tables, and taking orders from customers. Some glanced at Ethan but assumed he didn't want to be bothered. He had always kept himself separate, always refused attention, and always declined help. They respected his silence, thinking that giving him space was the kindest thing to do. But Lily, the young waitress who had been quietly observing him for months, noticed the subtle tremor in his hands, the way his shoulders hunched as if bracing against some invisible weight. She could see that he wasn't just tired. He was struggling. Without saying a word, Lily walked over to him. She didn't kneel and ask if he was okay, nor did she make any attempt to force conversation. Instead, she simply crouched down to his level and gently wrapped her arms around him in a warm, comforting hug. At first, Ethan froze. He had been touched by many people before, but he had learned to stiffen, to resist, to pull away. Touch often carried pity or judgment, and he had been hurt enough times to know how to protect himself. But this time was different. There was no expectation, no awkwardness, no condescension. It was just kindness pure, simple, and without conditions. At first he hesitated, unsure what to do. His mind raced with questions. Should he push away? Should he pretend nothing happened? But something about Lily's gentle presence made him pause. There was no rush, no insistence, just an openness that he had not felt in years. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he relaxed. The tension in his shoulders eased, the trembling in his hands stopped, and he let himself lean into the hug. It was a small surrender. A tiny crack in the armor he had built around himself for so long. For Ethan, that hug became more than just a physical gesture. It was a signal, almost a revelation, that someone could see him not as a disabled boy to be pitied or ignored, but as Ethan, a person worthy of warmth and care. The world he had long believed to be cold and indifferent suddenly seemed capable of gentle, human connection. It was a small moment, yet it carried immense weight. Years of isolation, fear, and loneliness seemed to press down on him, and for the first time he felt a lift, a subtle lightness in his heart. The cafe, with its soft lighting and quiet atmosphere, faded into the background as Ethan experienced something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time: safety. He realized in that instant that someone cared enough to notice his struggle, to respond not with words or advice but with action, a simple gesture that spoke louder than anything anyone had said before. It was not about solving his problems or changing his life in a single moment. It was about acknowledgement, recognition, a reminder that he was not invisible. As he pulled back slightly from the hug, he looked into Lily's eyes. They were kind, steady, and patient, without any trace of judgment or impatience. For a brief moment, Ethan felt something he had rarely experienced: trust. It was fragile, delicate, and new, but it existed. In that gaze, he understood that not everyone would turn away, not everyone would mock him, and not everyone would dismiss him. There were people willing to meet him where he was, to see him fully, and to offer compassion without strings attached. The moment lingered, stretching out in the quiet of the cafe. Ethan's mother arrived a few minutes later, apologizing for being late, but Ethan barely noticed. The hug had shifted something inside him. For once he felt a flicker of hope, a sense that the world could be different than he had imagined. The walls he had built around himself were still there, but now there was a tiny gap, point of entry for kindness, trust, and connection. In the following days, Ethan thought often about that hug. It replayed in his mind like a small, precious memory he could return to whenever he felt overwhelmed or alone. He began to recognize that human connection could be gentle, patient, and healing. The experience did not erase his struggles or make his disability disappear, but it gave him something far more valuable: a glimpse of possibility, a realization that he could allow others to enter his world without fear of harm or rejection. The cafe visits continued as before, but everything felt slightly different. Ethan began to notice Lily more, to respond to her greetings with small smiles or nods. He still remained quiet, cautious, and careful, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a willingness to be seen, a willingness to accept kindness. and a tiny opening in the protective walls he had spent years building. Each subsequent Saturday added to this fragile trust, reinforcing the lesson that a single act of compassion could change the trajectory of a lonely, isolated life. That rainy afternoon when Lily had hugged him became a turning point for Ethan. It was the moment he realized that the world was not entirely cold and unfeeling, that there were people willing to care without judgment, and that he could slowly begin to trust again. It was not an immediate transformation. He was still careful, still cautious, but it planted the seed for a change that would continue to grow, shaping his actions, thoughts, and interactions in the weeks and months to come. From that day forward, Ethan began to see the cafe as more than just a routine stop after therapy. It became a safe space, a place where he could experiment with trust, observe kindness, and experience small doses of connection. Lily's simple, quiet gesture had opened a door that had been firmly closed for years. It was a reminder that even in the smallest moments, human warmth could create profound impact, and that a single act of understanding could shift the way someone saw the world and themselves. After that rainy Saturday, a subtle change began in Ethan's life. The hug he had received from Lily, the young waitress at the cafe, had cracked open a part of his heart he had kept tightly shut for years. At first, the change was almost imperceptible. He still walked slowly, still avoided drawing attention to himself, and still kept his words to a minimum. But something inside him had shifted. He began to notice things he had ignored before: the warmth of the sun streaming through the window, the gentle murmur of conversations around him, the kindness in small, ordinary actions. Ethan's interactions with Lily became slightly more engaged. Where before he would sit silently and stare at his hands or the tabletop, he now allowed himself to look up and meet her gaze. When she greeted him with a cheerful "Good morning, Ethan," he would sometimes respond with a small nod or even a quiet hello. These were small steps, almost imperceptible, but they were the beginnings of a new willingness to connect with the world. He was testing, cautiously, whether kindness could be trusted. At home, his mother noticed the difference. The small smiles, the fleeting moments of laughter, and the subtle engagement in conversation were signs she had longed to see for years. She felt a cautious optimism, understanding that change would be gradual, but realizing that something powerful had begun to shift in her son. For Ethan, however, the world outside the cafe remained a place of uncertainty. The safety and warmth he had found with Lily had not yet extended to his classmates, his neighbors, or other strangers. Over the following weeks, Ethan began to experiment with trust in small ways. When he visited the cafe, he would linger a little longer than before, observing the environment, watching people move, and gradually allowing himself to be present without withdrawing into his thoughts. He would sometimes ask for his favorite snack or drink, testing whether requesting something from another person could be met with kindness rather than frustration or dismissal. Each small interaction reinforced the idea that there were safe spaces and safe people, and that not all attention or connection needed to be feared. Therapy sessions also reflected subtle changes. Ethan became more cooperative, engaging slightly more with his therapists and trying exercises he might have previously resisted. While he still experienced pain and frustration, he carried himself with a little more confidence, a quiet belief that he was capable of progress. This newfound openness wasn't dramatic, but it was steady, building like a foundation brick by brick. Each act of engagement, no matter how small, reinforced his belief that the world might hold kindness and support if he allowed himself to accept it. Ethan began to notice that kindness could extend beyond Lily. When other staff at the cafe offered him a gentle smile, held the door open, or brought his drink promptly, he no longer automatically withdrew. He began to recognize the effort and attention in these small gestures, understanding that they were meant to acknowledge him as a person, not as a problem to be managed. This realization was powerful, even though it felt fragile. He was still cautious, still wary of rejection, but the walls around his heart were beginning to crack. School, however, remained a challenge. While the cafe offered a controlled, safe environment, The world of classmates and playgrounds was unpredictable and sometimes harsh. But even here, Ethan carried with him a quiet confidence he had not known before. He began to offer small gestures of friendliness and nod, a brief smile, or a quiet comment when he felt safe. He did not yet fully engage with others, but he had begun to acknowledge that connection was possible. The hug from Lily had shown him that vulnerability did not always lead to pain. It could lead to understanding, compassion, and trust. Ethan's social skills grew slowly. He started to experiment with conversation, first with Lily, then with his mother. And eventually with peers he felt a little safer around. These attempts were tentative and awkward at times, but they were significant because they represented a willingness to step out of his comfort zone. The fear of judgment and rejection still existed, but it no longer dictated every action. He had discovered that opening up could lead to something positive, a small but profound shift in perspective that changed the way he approached relationships. Even small victories became monumental for Ethan. When he helped another child in the therapy room or offered to carry something for a peer, he felt a quiet satisfaction he had rarely experienced. It was as if he had unlocked a door to a world where he could contribute, be helpful, and be appreciated for his efforts rather than judged for his limitations. Each act of kindness he received or offered reinforced a new cycle. Trust begets connection. Connection begets confidence, and confidence begets growth. The cafe remained central to this transformation. Each visit reminded him that human connection could be gentle, patient, and unconditional. Lily's continued presence, her patience, and her consistent kindness became a reference point for how relationships could work. Ethan started to anticipate her smile and her friendly greetings, and in return, he allowed himself to respond, even if only with small gestures. Slowly, the fear and isolation that had defined much of his childhood began to loosen their grip. One day, during a particularly quiet morning at the cafe, Ethan offered Lily a small drawing he had made. It was a simple sketch, yet it carried meaning, a way of expressing gratitude without words, a way of saying that her kindness had mattered. Lily's eyes lit up with genuine delight, and she thanked him warmly, placing the drawing carefully behind the counter. For Ethan, this exchange was monumental. It confirmed what he had begun to feel, that he could engage with the world in meaningful ways, and that people could respond with warmth rather than judgment. Over time, Ethan began to generalize this sense of trust and openness to other parts of his life. At home, he expressed more of his feelings, shared his thoughts on books or games, and even participated more actively in family activities. He was still cautious and careful, but the spark of hope that had been ignited by a single hug was now spreading, influencing other areas of his life. The protective walls he had built were no longer impenetrable. There were frameworks being softened by consistent, gentle human connection. Ethan's journey was not without setbacks. Some days he would retreat again, feeling overwhelmed or tired. Some interactions at school reminded him of past rejections, and he would revert to silence. But even in those moments, the memory of Lily's hug, the knowledge that someone had seen him, cared for him, and accepted him without judgment, gave him the strength to return to the world, to try again, and to slowly rebuild trust in himself and others. By the end of that year, Ethan was no longer the same boy who had refused everyone. He had begun to experience the power of human kindness and connection, the way small gestures could shift perspectives, open hearts, and create change. While he still had a long journey ahead, the transformation that began with a simple hug had set him on a path toward growth, confidence, and the possibility of friendship. The walls he had built around himself were no longer permanent barriers, but gateways, slowly opening to a world he had once thought impossible to enter. Through patience, observation, and the unwavering presence of someone who cared, Ethan discovered a new way to live a life where connection, trust, and warmth were not threats, but invitations. The cafe became a symbol of hope, a place where he learned that opening his heart could lead to experiences he had long believed were beyond reach. The single act of kindness he received had transformed him, quietly and profoundly, into a boy ready to begin trusting the world again. Over the months following that rainy afternoon, Ethan continued to grow in ways he had never imagined possible. The hug from Lily, the quiet, patient waitress at the cafe, had opened a door that had been firmly closed for years. And now he was beginning to step through it. It was not a sudden transformation, nor was it free of challenges, but it was real and meaningful. Slowly, Ethan began to see the world and himself differently. Ethan's Saturdays at the cafe became something he looked forward to. No longer did he sit silently with his head down or retreat into his notebook. He began to greet Lily when she approached, sometimes with a small smile, sometimes with a quiet hello. These gestures were small, but to him they carried enormous weight. Each interaction reinforced the lesson he had begun to learn, that kindness could be trusted, that human connection was not something to fear, and that he could be seen and appreciated for who he truly was. At home, his mother noticed a remarkable change. Ethan was more communicative, sharing his thoughts and feelings more openly. He spoke about his therapy sessions, describing exercises he had tried, the pain he had endured, and small victories he had achieved. He even began to ask questions about the world around him, curious in ways he had not been before. The walls he had built to protect himself from disappointment were no longer solid. They were permeable, allowing love, trust, and warmth to enter. School remained a space of gradual progress. Ethan still faced challenges with classmates who did not understand him, but he approached these moments with newfound courage. He began to participate more actively in class discussions and offered small gestures of kindness to others when he could. If a peer struggled with an assignment or needed help carrying something, Ethan would quietly step in. These actions were not dramatic or celebrated, but they reflected a deep internal shift. He was beginning to believe that he could make a positive difference in the world, that he was capable of connection, that others could respond with gratitude and warmth rather than rejection. One afternoon, during therapy, Ethan noticed another child struggling to complete an exercise. In the past, he would have stayed focused on himself, wary of interference or attention. But now, something had changed. He approached the child gently, offering encouragement and assistance without hesitation. The child smiled, grateful for the help, and Ethan felt a quiet satisfaction bloom in his chest. For the first time, he realized that helping others could bring joy not only to them, but to himself as well. This simple act of empathy reinforced the lessons he had learned from Lily's kindness and his own slowly growing trust in human connection. The cafe continued to play a central role in Ethan's journey. Each visit became a subtle affirmation that kindness existed in the world. People could be patient and understanding, and that he could participate in life without fear. Lily remained a steady presence, her warmth consistent and reassuring. She never pressured him, never judged him, and never treated him differently because of his disability. Her actions, simple and quiet, became a blueprint for how relationships could work. Ethan observed, learned, and slowly began to replicate these behaviors in his own interactions with others. One day, Ethan took a small but meaningful step. He noticed a new child at the cafe, sitting alone and hesitant to interact with the staff. Without thinking, Ethan approached the child and offered a small greeting, a smile, and a gesture of comfort. The child's eyes lit up, and they began to feel a little less alone. In that moment, Ethan understood fully what he had learned through his own experiences, that one person's kindness could change someone's day, sometimes even someone's life. The hug he had received months ago was no longer just a memory. It had become a living lesson he could carry forward. Ethan's confidence grew steadily. He began to try new activities, something he had avoided for years. He joined a small art club at school, where he could share his creativity with others. He discovered that he enjoyed teaching younger children in the club, guiding them gently and patiently, much like Lily had guided him through her kindness. Each success, no matter how small, reinforced his belief that he could belong, that he could make friends, and that the world could be a place of connection rather than fear. Despite his progress, Ethan remained humble and aware of the fragility of trust. He knew that not every person would be kind, and he still approached some interactions cautiously. But the difference now was that he had learned to distinguish between judgment and genuine care. He had experienced the possibility of unconditional kindness, and this knowledge gave him the courage to continue engaging with the world. Even when it was uncertain or challenging, at home, at school, and at the cafe, Ethan began to experience a life that felt fuller and more meaningful than he had ever known. He laughed more easily, shared his ideas more freely, and even spoke about his dreams for the future. He wanted to help others, to share what he had learned about trust and compassion, and to create moments of connection wherever he could. The boy who had once refused everyone was now slowly stepping into a world where relationships could be nurturing and rewarding. One evening, Ethan's mother reflected on the transformation in her son. She remembered the years of silence, the cautious avoidance, and the walls he had built around his heart. Now, she saw a boy who had discovered hope, who had begun to trust, and who was learning the value of kindness. She knew that the journey was ongoing, but the progress was undeniable. The small, consistent gestures of human compassion from his mother, from Lily, from others had combined to create something extraordinary, a boy learning to embrace life fully. Despite the challenges he faced, Ethan himself understood, in a quiet, deep way, how much had changed. He realized that the hug he had received at the cafe was not just a moment of comfort. It had been a turning point, a lesson in the power of simple human connection. He had learned that vulnerability could be met with care, kindness could inspire courage, and that he could trust, even when the world sometimes seemed unkind. These lessons became part of him, shaping the way he approached relationships, challenges, and life itself. By the time another rainy Saturday arrived, Ethan's relationship with the cafe and with Lily had evolved further. He no longer needed to hide in the corner or retreat into his notebook. He engaged with the environment, helped other children feel welcome, and even shared small acts of kindness with the staff and regular customers. The cafe had become a symbol of possibility, a safe space where trust could be built, and where the lessons of human warmth and understanding could be experienced. Firsthand, Ethan's story became an example of how small acts of kindness could ripple outward, creating meaningful change in a person's life. Lily never saw herself as a hero, but in Ethan's eyes, she had been the person who quietly demonstrated that compassion and patience could transform a lonely heart. Her single gesture, a hug, had shown him that he mattered, that he could be seen, that life could hold moments of connection and hope. The boy who had once refused everyone had begun to embrace life. He laughed with others, helped those in need, shared his thoughts and creativity, approached the world with cautious optimism. He had learned that human connection was not something to fear, but something to nurture. The walls he had built to protect himself were still there, but they were no longer barriers. They were reminders of how far he had come and of the importance of kindness, patience, and trust. In the end, Ethan's journey was about more than a single hug. It was about the power of consistent compassion, the importance of small gestures, and the way human connection can change the trajectory of a life. It was about learning to trust, to hope, and to believe in the possibility of love and friendship even after years of isolation. Ethan had discovered a new world, not one without challenges, but one where he could participate fully, with courage, empathy, and joy.